Brandon inherited his grandfather's secluded cabin by Blackwood Lake, a place deeply tied to his family's history and legacy, a refuge where generations before him had sought peace and solitude. Shortly after settling in, however, he received an official-looking letter from the Silver Pines Homeowners Association, informing him that his property had been annexed into the HOA's jurisdiction, meaning he was now subject to their rules, fees, and oversight. Confused, Brandon dug into county records and discovered that the supposed annexation had never been formally approved, nor had he ever agreed to join the HOA, making their claim illegitimate. When he confronted the HOA board at a meeting, led by a smug and dismissive man named Ronald, they brushed him off, insisting that the decision was final and that he would be subject to penalties if he refused to comply. Brandon's defiance immediately made him a target, and soon after, he began experiencing mysterious disturbances around his property. His mail was tampered with, HOA notices were nailed aggressively to his front door, and there were clear signs that someone had trespassed while he was away. As he continued to resist their demands, the intimidation escalated. Anonymous threats were left on his doorstep, his property was vandalized, and suspicious individuals were spotted lingering near the tree line late at night. One evening, he returned from a supply run to find his cabin broken into, furniture overturned, and a hateful message spray-painted across the living room wall, making it clear that someone wanted him gone. Furious but undeterred, Brandon refused to back down, installing security cameras around his property and reaching out to local authorities, though the response was lukewarm at best since the HOA had strong local influence. Determined to fight back, he dug deeper into the HOA's dealings and uncovered a disturbing pattern. Other homeowners had also been pressured into compliance through intimidation tactics, with some even forced to sell their homes under duress. Through his research, Brandon discovered that the HOA had been secretly redrawing boundary lines and manipulating paperwork to absorb properties into their control, often without the owners realizing it until it was too late. His security cameras soon captured crucial evidence: masked intruders attempting to break into his home under the cover of darkness, which he promptly handed over to a trusted friend in law enforcement, Frank, who had long suspected the HOA was up to something illegal. Realizing he finally had concrete proof of criminal activity, Brandon braced himself for the battle ahead, knowing that exposing the HOA's corruption would take more than just persistence. It would require a full-scale legal assault. Armed with the security footage of the masked intruders attempting to break into his cabin, Brandon took the evidence straight to Frank, who immediately recognized that this was more than just petty harassment. It was an organized effort by the HOA to drive him out. Frank, a veteran officer with deep ties to the county, had long harbored suspicions about the Silver Pines HOA but lacked the hard proof necessary to act. With Brandon's footage, they finally had enough to justify a deeper investigation, and Frank wasted no time in securing a warrant to dig into the HOA's records. Meanwhile, Brandon refused to let up, bolstering his home security with reinforced locks, motion sensor lights, and additional cameras, fully aware that the HOA wouldn't back down easily. The intimidation tactics only grew worse in response. His phone rang at odd hours with silence on the other end. Tire tracks appeared near his property line, as if someone had been watching from a distance. And once, in the dead of night, he woke to the sound of footsteps on his porch, only to find muddy boot prints leading away into the darkness. Despite the threats, he remained steadfast, knowing that caving to fear would only embolden them further. Determined to gather more evidence, he started interviewing other homeowners who had been victimized by the HOA, many of whom shared eerily similar experiences: unauthorized fines, property damage, and even the sudden disappearance of paperwork proving their ownership. One elderly couple, who had lived in the area for decades, tearfully recounted how they had been strong-armed into selling their home for a fraction of its worth after relentless harassment. Another homeowner revealed that his dog had mysteriously gone missing right after he refused to pay an arbitrary fine the HOA had slapped on him for an unapproved fence. As Brandon pieced the stories together, a sinister pattern emerged. The HOA, under Ronald's leadership, had been systematically targeting homeowners whose properties were not originally part of the association, forcing them into compliance or pushing them out entirely. The motivation became clear when Brandon uncovered internal memos that hinted at a larger scheme. Silver Pines was planning a major expansion, and any property in their way had to be absorbed or eliminated to increase land value and secure lucrative development deals. The deeper he dug, the more damning the evidence became, until finally, with Frank's help, they built a case strong enough to take to the county prosecutor. A full-scale investigation was launched, leading to search warrants being executed at the HOA's offices and the homes of key board members, including Ronald and his right-hand man, Albert. On the day of the raid, Brandon stood at a distance and watched as law enforcement stormed the HOA headquarters, emerging minutes later with boxes of confiscated documents, hard drives, and most satisfyingly, Ronald himself in handcuffs. The arrogant smirk that had been permanently plastered on Ronald's face was gone, replaced with rage and desperation as he shouted protests about being a respected businessman and how the HOA had done nothing wrong. His pleas fell on deaf ears as the deputies carted him away, while more officers continued combing through the office, unearthing files that detailed years of fraudulent activity, maps with suspicious boundary adjustments, contracts designed to entrap homeowners, and emails revealing how they had coordinated break-ins against resistant property owners all painted a damning picture. Frank, standing beside Brandon, clapped a firm hand on his shoulder, a satisfied grin on his face as he said, "This is a big break. We finally got him." Brandon felt a surge of vindication, but it was tempered by the weight of everything he had endured. The threats, the break-ins, the destruction of his home, all in the name of someone else's greed. However, the fight wasn't over yet, as the legal battle was just beginning, and Brandon knew that while Ronald's arrest was a victory, there were still more battles to be won. With Ronald and several key members of the Silver Pines HOA in custody, the legal battle began, and while Brandon had won a significant victory, the fight was far from over. The prosecution moved quickly, charging Ronald, Albert, and several of their associates with conspiracy, fraud, trespassing, and burglary, among other offenses. However, despite the mountain of evidence stacked against them, the HOA leadership didn't go down without a fight. Ronald, still clinging to the delusion that he could talk his way out of trouble, hired an expensive legal team that initially tried to discredit the evidence, claiming that Brandon had entrapped the HOA by setting up his cameras. That argument was swiftly dismissed, as the footage clearly showed criminal activity. Next, Ronald's lawyers attempted to shift the blame onto Albert and the hired enforcers, portraying Ronald as an unaware and misguided leader who had no idea what his subordinates had been doing. This defense crumbled when prosecutors presented emails directly linking Ronald to the break-ins, harassment strategies, and even the falsification of property records. Albert, seeing the writing on the wall, quickly turned on Ronald, agreeing to a plea deal in exchange for a lighter sentence. He detailed how Ronald had orchestrated the entire scheme, from identifying which properties to target to deploying intimidation tactics designed to wear down homeowners until they either submitted or sold their land at a loss. With Albert's testimony sealing the case, Ronald was left with no choice but to accept a plea deal of his own, though it still resulted in a substantial prison sentence. The other board members faced varying degrees of legal repercussions. Some were found guilty of negligence and fined heavily, while others, who had actively participated in the scheme, received jail time. Meanwhile, as the criminal trials played out, civil lawsuits began piling up against the HOA. Homeowners who had been strong-armed into selling their properties filed claims, demanding restitution for their losses, and with the overwhelming evidence of fraud, the courts ruled decisively in their favor. Brandon's case was among the first to be settled, with the judge swiftly voiding the illegal annexation of his property and ordering the HOA to pay damages for the destruction they had caused to his cabin. The restitution checks covered the repairs, but the sense of violation lingered. However, Brandon refused to dwell in bitterness, choosing instead to channel his energy into rebuilding what had been taken from him. He spent weeks restoring his cabin, repairing the broken windows, replacing the damaged furniture, and repainting the vandalized walls. Each hammer strike, each brush of paint felt like reclaiming a piece of his family's legacy. Throughout this process, he found solace in the unwavering support of his cousin Ashley and Officer Frank, both of whom had stood by him from the beginning. In the aftermath of the scandal, Silver Pines estates fell into disarray. With its leadership dismantled and finances drained by legal battles, the HOA collapsed, leaving the once powerful organization a husk of what it had been. Property values in the community plummeted as banks became hesitant to issue loans in an area tainted by fraud, and many residents who had turned a blind eye to the HOA's corrupt dealings found themselves in financial ruin. Some attempted to form a new, legitimate HOA, but the community's reputation was so damaged that few were willing to take part, and the effort ultimately failed. Meanwhile, the county government launched an internal review, implementing stricter oversight measures to prevent similar schemes from occurring in the future. The victory was complete, but for Brandon, the most important outcome wasn't the downfall of the HOA. It was the fact that his family's land remained intact, untouchable by greed and corruption. One evening, about a month after the final lawsuits were settled, Brandon sat on his porch with a glass of whiskey in hand, watching the sunset over Blackwood Lake. The air was crisp, the pine trees swayed gently in the wind, and for the first time in months, he felt truly at peace. Ashley pulled up in her truck, her face lit with excitement as she shared the news that the last of the restitution payments had gone through. "You did it, Brandon," she said, stepping up onto the porch. "They're done for good." He took a slow sip of his drink, letting the warmth settle in his chest, before nodding with quiet satisfaction. "Damn right I did," he said. "And I couldn't have done it without you, Frank," and a little bit of old-fashioned stubbornness. They stood together in comfortable silence, gazing out over the lake, the land that had been fought for and won. The shadows that had once loomed over his home had finally lifted, replaced by a calm certainty. This cabin, this land, was his. No one would ever take it from him, not while he still drew breath. He thought of his grandfather, of his father, and of the generations before them who had built this place with their own hands, and he felt their presence in the wind, in the trees, in the very walls that surrounded him. He had defended their legacy, and in doing so, ensured that it would endure for years to come. With a final, deep breath, he let the last remnants of tension slip away, knowing that he had not only won a legal battle, but had reclaimed something even more important: his peace, his home, and his right to live without fear. This completes the full 20-minute story, structured across 3 key points. Let me know if you need any